Welcome to The Rational Mind. Today we're looking at religious experiences, which is chapter 1.5 in the OCR A-Level Religious Studies specification. So what is distinctive about religious experiences? Religious experiences can be difficult to define and difficult for people to put into words to describe it if they have such an experience, because it's such an intense thing for people to experience, as you can see in the picture here. So it's often understood to be some kind of encounter between people and the divine. And it's often a solitary experience, but can also be corporate. So it could be shared between a group of people. So as you can see in the image here, it's either as a whole with loads of different people, as you can see here, or it's experienced by yourself with the divine. So either or. And before we move on, take a pause of the video and see whether you can define these key terms. So mystical experiences are experiences of God or of the supernatural which go beyond everyday sense experiences. Numinus experiences is an indescribable experience which invokes feelings of awe, worship, and fascination. A conversion experience is an experience which produces a radical change in someone's belief system. And a corporate religious experience is a religious experience which happens to a group of people as one body. So we're going to go through different forms of religious experience that are on the OCR syllabus. So firstly, we're going to go through what a mystical experience is in more detail. So it refers to a sense of connection with God at a deep personal level, where God is beyond the boundaries of reason and knowledge. So it's a relatively modern term that is used to convey the idea that all religions share a common sense of the divine expressed in different ways. So it's again kind of going against what you can describe. And mystical experiences are difficult to describe in ordinary everyday language. And F.C. Happel's book, Mysticism, A Study and an Anthology, looks at this kind of religious experience in different traditions, including Christianity. So that's Hinduism, Islam, or Judaism, or whatever other religion as well. So mysticism conveys the idea that this physical world is not all there is there, and that God is the foundation of everything. So you can see in this image, it's looking beyond what is in the physical world to, in this sense, look at the universe. But this could be anything. It could be God, it could be a superpower, it could be anything, a higher power. So God is not known through reason, but through intuition. So it's the sense and the feeling through the soul, rather than the rational mind itself. And it often arises with prayer and contemplation, and they can involve seeing visions or hearing voices. And the recipient of the numinous experience is filled with awe and a sense of wonder or worship. So it's maybe like a feeling that something's there, rather than a mystical experience is more, hearing voices, whilst numinous ones are more a feeling of God or something being present. And there are many well-known experiences of religious experiences, and one of the most famous ones is St. Bernadette and the Virgin Mary at Lourdes. So this is St. Bernadette, as you can see here, when she was younger, and she had the visions, I think it was 18 visions of Mary, and after that they built a grotto and put a statue of Mary where it is, and a lot of people go to view Lourdes. And there have been a lot of miracles happen there. The water that is there seems to have healing powers, and has been recorded of, I think, around 80 or 90 miracles, of where 2 or 3 doctors have said that there's no scientific explanation why people have been cured of cancer, for example. So from a religious experience have turned into miracles as well. And you can see here that a massive church has been built in the place where Bernadette had this religious experience. And the well-known religious experiences also include Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis of Assisi, profound religious experience involved a deep conversion with a subsequent commitment to living in radical poverty and service to others, inspired by his vision of Christ and his call to repair the church. And this included embracing a life of simplicity, humility, serving lepers, so people that had leprosy, and eventually finding the Franciscan order. And later in his life, he received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, so the wounds of Christ, his crucifixion, so on his hands and feet. And this further intensified his identification with Christ's suffering and solidified his religious devotion. So the religious experience here is the stigmatas. Another really well-known experience is Teresa of Avila. And her religious experiences were multifaceted, so it included visions of Christ, encounters with angels and demons, and periods of ecstasy. And she described her experiences in detail, including her famous transfiguration experience where an angel pierced the heart, or her heart, with a golden dart. And these experiences led her to have a deep understanding of God and her own spiritual journey, which she documented in works like The Interior Castle. So more about her interior castle. So she had a vision of the spiritual life as a diamond castle with 7 sets of mansions, as you can kind of see in this image how it goes through the different parts of the mansion. And these mansions go deeper into the centre of the soul, where God resides. So the metaphor is this: the soul is envisioned as a crystal castle, with each mansion representing a different level of spiritual development. And the progression is this: the soul's journey from the outer rooms, where one grapples with self-knowledge and initial spiritual practices, towards her inner chambers, one experiences greater intimacy with God. So the more you go in, the more intimacy there is with God. So these are the stages. So the mansions between 1 to 3 focus on the initial stages of spiritual life. So it includes self-awareness, prayer, and the beginning to understand God's presence. Mansions 4 to 6 involve a deeper prayer and contemplation and experiencing God's presence more intensely. And these stages include periods of dryness and consolation, as well as trials and temptations. And Mansion 7 represents the culmination of the journey, so where the soul experiences complete union with God, often described as a spiritual marriage. And the key themes within these mansions is firstly prayer, because this is a central practice throughout the journey. So it involves from vocal prayer to more advanced forms of contemplation. Humility, because it recognizes one's dependence on God and striving for selflessness. Self-knowledge, so understanding one's own strengths and weaknesses, is crucial for spiritual growth. Trust in God, because faith in God's guidance and grace is essential for navigating the journey. And the goal of this is to achieve union with God through a state of profound intimacy and oneness with the divine. Another really well-known religious experience that is a biblical experience is the voices heard by Samuel in the Bible. So Samuel initially struggles to distinguish God's voice from that of the priest Eli, because basically Samuel is outside and he keeps hearing someone calling his name, Samuel, Samuel. So he goes in and says, "Did you call me?" And the priest says no. So he goes back outside. Again he hears, "Samuel, Samuel." He goes inside and says, "Did you call me?" The priest says no. And again he heard these voices, "Samuel, Samuel." But at this stage, he realized it was God calling him. And he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that is when he realizes. So that was the religious experiences that he had. Another experience might be the burning bush and Moses. Again, the burning bush speaking to Moses, which is meant to be God. And now we're going to go through conversion experiences. So they're a separate form of experience. So these involve abandoning an old way of life and adopting a new one based on an inner experience. So sometimes conversion experiences are dramatic and sometimes they are gradual. And H.D. Lewis's book on Our Experiences of God describes a pattern found in many conversion experiences. And this is the pattern. So firstly, the individual is dissatisfied with the current system of ideas. For whatever reason, they might see if it's not working, or they feel empty, or they think there's something better. The person then searches for answers. So they might read scripture, or they might try going to church or a mosque or whatever religion they're interested in. There is a point of crisis. So this can be emotional, with a sense of presence of God, and the person might see a vision, they might hear a voice, or have a strong sense of forgiveness. So it doesn't have to be that you hear something or anything like that. It might just be a numinous experience, the fact that you might feel a presence. So again, it kind of varies for each individual. This then leads of a sense of peace and joy from the individual, them feeling that, and having a keenness to tell others about the experience, which then in the long run turns to change the direction of the person and hence causes a conversion. And again, he's not saying that everyone does this, but this is the kind of system and structure that most conversions follow, whether it's quite dramatic or whether it's over a long period of time. And conversions have been the focus of a lot of psychological studies because of this kind of gradual change and the steps and the stages that it takes you through. And William James, that we're going to look at later, says that in a conversion experience, sometimes something which was at the edge of a person's conscious becomes at its centre. So it's basically something that they were kind of gripping on or thinking about becomes the centre of everything that they do, and that's what causes them to maybe look for a different system of beliefs. And religious aims become a habitual focus of energy for them. And as I said before, the well-known conversion experiences includes the conversion of Paul on the road to Damascus. So St. Paul's soul at this time being blinded by a light. Saul was a tax collector. He persecuted Christians, but when he was blinded and heard God's voice, he then converted to Christianity, and obviously became one eventual Christian. So that's a massive conversion experience here that you can use. Then we have corporate religious experiences. And a corporate religious experience is when several different people all have the same religious experience at the same time. So some people think these have more evidential force as there are more witnesses to the experience. As you can see in this image, everyone's kind of experiencing it together, so there's more people to say, yes, that happened. And others think that people would be carried along by others' emotions and that they don't have the same more evidential force. And well-known corporate experiences include the story of Pentecost and modern experiences of the Toronto Blessing, which we're going to go through. So at Pentecost, what happened is the disciples were sat without Jesus because he ascended into heaven at this point, and they were feeling a bit frightened. And the Holy Spirit, represented by the dove here, came down, and they all had tongues of fire above their heads, which then caused them to speak in tongues and share the message of God, of the gospel, with everyone in the community. So this is meant to be a shared corporate experience because they were all experiencing it together. They were all speaking in tongues and spreading the word of God. A more modern example of a corporate experience is the Toronto Blessing. So it refers to a Christian revival that all originated in January 1994 at Airport Vineyard Church. So this revival was characterised by unusual physical phenomena, including uncontrollable laughter, wailing, and even animal noises as described in one source. So they were all having these experiences. You can see they're kind of having different ones. Some people are lying here, some people are shouting and dancing, some people are making noises, but they were all experiencing it together. And the movement, which was later renamed Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship and then Catch the Fire Toronto, drew significant attention and became a global phenomenon within the Pentecostal and charismatic churches. But there's also been a lot of studies with this, which we're going to look into more detail of the psychological and physiological and more scientific explanations maybe for this experience. A negative of a corporate experience that you can use is the Jonestown Massacre. So this is an example of where a corporate experience might negatively impact people, which then cause them to have harm done on themselves. So Jonestown was a location of a mass murder-suicide of members of the California-based People's Temple cult. It's called a cult. Obviously, at the time, people didn't call it that, but nowadays it's seen as one. And at the behest of the charismatic but paranoid leader, Jim Jones, in Jonestown's agricultural commune, Ghana. So the death toll exceeded 900, and including 300 who were aged 17 or under, making the incident one of the largest mass deaths in American history. But again, it started as, a corporate experience, so people were getting healed, very much charismatic Christianity things. People were getting healed, they were embedded within society, they felt part of this community, but Jim Jones is seen mostly as a cult leader, obviously benefiting himself, and most likely taking a lot of money from these individuals who believed that he was, performing miracles. So he opened his first church in the mid-50s in Indianapolis. At the time, he was not affiliated with any particular denomination and had no theological training, and his congregation was known for being racially integrated, which was particularly progressive at the time. And in the 60s, his congregation, by then called the People's Temple, affiliated with the Disciples of Christ, and for years later, he was ordained in that church. And he had thousands of followers, and a large percentage of them were African American, and flocked to him, and central to Jim Jones' appeal were displays of mind reading and faith healing. So again, people were kind of drawn into that. There are lots of psychological reasons for that, which we're going to go into, but this is where you can kind of see where corporate experiences can be a bit, people following a crowd and feeling that something happens because everyone else is also feeling it, which then can trigger your own experiences. Now we're going to look into near-death experiences, which are slightly different. So these are experiences that are sometimes reported by people whose hearts have been stopped, who have stopped beating, or who have been in a coma. And the similarities in descriptions include a sense of being or feeling out of body, feeling a loving presence, or a sense of great peace, and a feeling as if through travelling through a tunnel or towards a bright light. So these are similarities that people who have had near-death experiences have felt. And some people see these as evidence of life after death, whilst others are more sceptical and think they are more likely to have a natural scientific explanation. An example that you can use, which I often use, is for a near-death experience and a conversion, you can go to merge them together, is there was a man who was drowning, and he was an atheist. But as he was drowning in the middle of the ocean, there was no land anywhere near, and he heard the voice of God saying, well, if you devote your life to Christianity, I will spare you and I will give you another chance at life. And the next thing the man remembers is waking up on a beach. And because of that, he did devote his life to Christianity because he had this near-death experience. So it was so profound of him, or the effect of it was so profound, that he did do what he promised, or he thought he promised to God, whether you believe he had a near-death experience and a religious experience with God or not. And now we're going to look at some key thinkers in the study of religious experience. So what scholars really support and do a lot of work on this. So the first one is William James. So he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experiences in 1902. And he aimed to take an objective scientific approach to religious experience and explore it through collecting people's own accounts of their experiences. And he thought that religious experience could be tested for validity by its long-lasting effects, just as medicine can be tested by seeing whether it makes the patient feel better or not. So this is a really good analogy you can use. So his approach to understanding truth is pragmatic, which means he's motivated by seeing the practical results for a religious experience, whether it's actually true, whether it actually was a religious experience, or whether it was something else. He's just looking at how it affects people. So for him, there are 4 ways and 4 qualities of religious experience. So the first one is ineffability. So the fact that it's difficult to express in normal everyday words. A second is a noetic quality. So the recipients feel they have learnt something they didn't know before. The third one, that is transience. The experience do not, that's meant to say, last very long. So they might be only a couple of seconds long, it might be an hour, it might be 5 minutes. But the actual effects of it has a very long effect. It may last a lifetime. And passivity, so the person feels the experience is happening to them rather than they are doing it. They're being led. They're not actively seeking it out. It's just happening to them. So James noticed that religious experiences feel very convincing to people who have them. So he basically concluded that religious experiences does not prove anything. So it doesn't prove that there is a God, or there isn't, but they should be taken seriously, because most likely if someone's saying they had a religious experience, they most likely did have it. But whether it is a God or something else is another question. And then we have Rudolf Otto. And he wrote a book later than James called The Idea of the Holy in 1917. And he aimed to explore the nature of the divine as encountered through religious experience. So he thought it was central to religion that people should experience God or the divine. And he thought that the divine could be described as mysterium tremendum et fascinatus. So an awe-inspiring, fascinating mystery. And he thought that the divine has three main characteristics in a religious experience. So the first one is that it's a quality of mystery, making the individual realise that God can never be fully understood. It's a quality of ultimate importance, and a quality that is both attractive and dangerous. So you can interpret this how you want. So it can either be, it's attractive because it can bring you closer to God, but it can also be dangerous because it might lead to, a near-death experience, or the fact that, you never know whether it is the right thing or not, like maybe the people in the Jonestown massacre. They wanted a connection with God, but it actually wasn't the right thing for them. And then we have Richard Swinburne, and he had principles of credulity and testimony. So he wrote a book called Is There a God in 1979, and he was a Christian scientist. So he argued that people should take religious experiences as seriously as other kinds of experiences. And in his principle of credulity, he said that we should be prepared to trust our own experiences unless we have good reason not to. So basically, if it seems to us that we are experiencing God, then we need to be prepared that we are actually experiencing God. So for example, if you know that you're a sane mind and you experience God, you should believe and think that you did experience God. But if you have a substance abuse problem, for example, and you were either high or drunk when you had a religious experience, then you need to know that it's most likely that your experience was induced by a narcotic or alcohol, rather than actually being God. And then he has this principle of credulity. So he said that if people tell us they have had a religious experience, then we need to be prepared to believe them unless we have good grounds not to. So again, if I know my sister has schizophrenia, for example, and she tells me she's had a religious experience, she most likely probably didn't have a religious experience. She probably had a hallucination, and she believes she had a religious experience. However, if I know my sister doesn't have schizophrenia, and she had a religious experience, maybe a vision, then I should believe that she did. So they're very similar, but credulity is to do with yourself, testimony is to do with other people. But they're basically the same principles. But then there's people who have non-religious understanding of religious experience, and they are slightly different, and they could count against religious experiences. So firstly, there are psychological interpretations of religious experiences. And the first one we're going to look at is from Ludwig Feuerbach. He was very influential in psychological interpretations of religious experience, and he argued that God was an invention of the human mind. And he thought that people transfer all of their highest ideals and hopes onto this God, and we imagine him to be all the things that we wish we were themselves. And this kind of influenced then Freud's psychological thinking on religious experience. And if you want to know more about Freud in more detail, then look at my conscience video where I go a bit into more detail on this. But he was obviously a founder of modern psychology and used similar ideas of his interpretation of religion. And he thought that the mind was made up of the ego, the id, and the superego. And like I said, you can look at that in more detail in my conscience video. He thought that the subconscious layers of the mind lead people into believing that there is a God, but this is an infantile neurosis. So the fact that it's childish. They cannot cope with being adults in the world, so they make up imaginary parent figures, which are then portrayed as God. So for him, religious experiences happens when this subconscious intervention takes over the imagination. So for Freud, people who have religious experiences need psychological treatment. And now I'm going to give you an example where, again, you can use as an example against religious experiences, but where people maybe scam individuals. So the example I want to show you is Padre Pio, and he also had stigmatas. So he is a saint, and he was an Italian priest who was known for his adoration of charity and love for the people around him. And he bore a stigmata, like I said, the wounds of Christ, as you can see here. And there's an Italian historian, Sergio Luzzatto, and he basically released Padre Pio's miracles and politics in the 20th century Italy, because he produced a book with new evidence from Vatican archives saying that proves that the charismatic friar secretly poured carbolic acid, which basically on his hands, which burns his hands and feet and sides, which causes these wounds. So there's evidence of that. So again, maybe in more modern context, we have to be more skeptical of religious experiences because there could be other explanations to them. So again, it's looking maybe at what Swinburne said about testimony and credulity. It's thinking more, well, if you know them to be an honest person, then they most likely did have it. But if you know them to be a scheming person, then they probably are scheming and not being truthful. But then there are also psychological interpretations of religious experiences. So neurophysiology is the study of the brain and the nervous system. And some neurophysiological studies of religious experience suggest that such experiences have a natural cause rather than a supernatural one. And the biggest example is Persinger's helmet. So it's a device invented by Michael Persinger in the 80s, and he basically created it to induce similar feelings to those of religious experience. You can see in this helmet, it sends or triggers electrical areas in your brain that would induce religious experiences. So it's basically showing that it could be magnetic fields that we're experiencing rather than a god. For example, when we have a numinous experience of feeling a presence, it might actually just be magnetic fields that we're feeling and not a higher power. And studies of near-death experiences sometimes show that these sensations can be created artificially, and the findings could suggest that near-death experiences are caused by endorphins or other emotion-altering hormones in the body rather than a god. So that's all the AO1 knowledge. Take a pause of the video now to see whether you can answer these questions. And now it's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. So firstly, we're looking at conversion experiences. So can conversion experiences present powerful evidence for the existence of God? Discuss. So with the AO1 knowledge that you would have here, is obviously focusing on conversions. So looking at descriptions and explanations of conversions with, thinkers that support this, thinkers that go against it, and examples of what you can use. Examples and explanations of examples, description and explanation of examples of conversions with reference to sources of wisdom and authority. So this would be, for example, Paul on the road to Damascus in the Bible. And then a description and evaluation of the views of thinkers who claim that conversion is or isn't evidence for the existence of God. So you might want to talk about James, Swinburne and Freud. You might also want to suggest what might be more convincing. So you might think mystical experiences are more convincing, or numerous experiences, or near-death experiences, or corporate experiences. So you can talk about those and thinkers that support those things too. And with AO2, with supporting the argument, you can look at the existence of God being the best explanation for a dramatic change in someone's way of thinking. These can be the points that you make. Obviously, you need to put the evidence, explanation, support, and response and criticisms in there as well. Principles of Causality and Testimony by Swinburne successfully make the case that people's experiences of God should be taken at face value. It's supported by the Bible, which could be seen as authoritative, and James successfully argues that a conversion experience can be tested for validity by its long-lasting positive effect, so in his four principles. To disagree, you might say that there's better, more plausible explanations of conversions rather than that they came from God. So psychology and neurophysiology offers some natural explanations for religious experiences, so they might be more persuasive than the belief that they arise from encounters with God. And Swinburne's principle only applies to everyday sense experiences but are not appropriate for religious experiences. That could be a point you make, and then you need to evaluate it, obviously. And James's test of religious experiences is unconvincing, as long-lasting effects could occur without them being attributed to God. And obviously you need a strong introduction and conclusion there as well. If we look at the second question, so how convincing are William James's conclusions about religious experience? Always remember in these questions, you need to answer the question. So this is specifically asking about William James and religious experiences. So you need to focus on that and really link your arguments and points to that. So with the AO1 knowledge, you want to look at really going in depth on James's conclusions about religious experience. So including his ideas about the characteristics of religious experience and the ways it can be tested for validity through a pragmatic approach. His conclusions that religious experiences deserve to be taken seriously as part of the human experience. And for the AO2, you could be critical about his evaluation and discuss whether he is right or to characterise it in different ways, and whether his list needs additions, whether, Otto might have a better evaluation, or you might think Freud has a better one. So again, you can pin up different people against each other, but answering the question whether James is sufficient enough. Maybe he's not. You might want to give a critical evaluation of his pragmatic test of religious experience, so considering whether it is a reliable test, whether other kinds of tests might be better, or whether religious experiences can be tested at all. You might want to evaluate his conclusions that religious experiences should be taken seriously and discuss whether it can be dismissed as an infantile neurosis from Freud, or whether it's worthwhile subject to have further inquiry. And obviously you can then have a strong conclusion as well. So that's all on religious experience. Join me next time for more religious studies, philosophy and ethics.